Just to say hello and welcome. My name is Rachel Rosen. I work at University College London, and I'm part of the Critical Childhood Studies Research Group, which is hosting today's event, the talk by Professor Jessica Taft. The Kids Are in Charge, but Adults Talk Too Much, Age and Power and the Peruvian Movement of Working Children. Our group, I'll just say a few introductory remarks before I turn over to Jessica and then to Stuart Tannock, who as our respondent. So our Critical Childhood Studies Research Group at UCL is a pretty new group, and it's an effort of those of us working at UCL who are exploring the complex links between unequal childhoods and social justice in our research, our teaching, and our public engagement. So we're concerned with questions around how social, political, cultural, and economic changes globally are affecting childhood as a social institution, as well as young people's creative and activist responses to these dynamic global contexts. And so in this vein, we're really so excited to be hosting Professor Taft over the next few months at UCL. In the Social Research Institute, and to be lucky to be having her speak with us today. Professor Taft is a professor of Latin American and Latino Studies at the University of California in Santa Cruz in the USA. And her work focuses on the political lives of children and young people across the Americas. I think for me, just to say personally, one of the things that I think is so exciting about Jessica's work is that she gives a really important grounding for thinking about some of the ways in which children and young people's activism is only now really making it into the public fore. I mean, so from Black Lives Matters to climate strikes and climate activism, we're seeing young people's activism in the news more and more, and as sort of a more open and willingness to understand this as not truancy or some form of bad discipline, but as participation in movements for social transformation. So what Jessica's work does, I think, is provide us with insights about the background to some of these more recent movements, but also ways to think about and understand the ways categories of children, childhood, youth, adulthood intersect with social movements for progressive change. So we're really excited to have her speaking here today. Jessica will speak for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we'll be followed by a response from Dr. Stuart Tannock, who's an associate professor at UCL Institute of Education. He's also a member of the Critical Childhood Studies Research Group. His work focuses on critical youth studies and on, I think one of the really exciting aspects of Stuart's work is an Educating and Organizing for Social Change module that he created and leads with undergraduate students. And these undergraduate students work with children and young people in the London area as part of this module in terms of projects of social transformation. So I think that it will be a really interesting conversation between Jessica and Stuart, and then we'll open up for question, answer, and discussion. So over to you now, Jessica.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Great. So I am really incredibly grateful to Rachel and to the UCL Critical Childhood Studies Research Group for hosting me while I'm here in London. Rachel has been more than anyone could ask for as a host, just incredibly generous and inclusive and really welcoming. Also, just as a quick warning, my building tests the fire alarms every Thursday, sometime between 11 and 2. It hasn't happened yet today. It might happen while I'm speaking. If that happens, I will go ahead and mute myself and pause for a moment, and then I'll come back. It's usually only about 15 seconds, but hopefully I'll catch it and it won't be too loud for all of you for too long. So My talk today really draws mostly from my fairly recent book on the Peruvian movement of working children, but it also extends beyond it a little bit, referencing some new thinking that I've been doing in response to what I see as a kind of reanimated public interest in young people's activism. And while some politicians and pundits respond to young people's activism with outright dismissals, others offer patronizing and often overly effusive praise. More journalists, parents, teachers, and NGOs are also beginning to ask, what can we, as adults, do to support young activists? And what's the appropriate role for adults in child and youth-led movements? And these are good questions, but they're also far more thorny than many who ask them initially imagine. So as you'll hear today, the Peruvian movement of working children has been striving to build a horizontal, kid-led, intergenerational social movement for over 40 years. So this movement offers us a powerful model with many inspiring and effective practices, and it provides an opportunity to identify the very real challenges to collaborative intergenerational activism. So founded in 1976, the Peruvian movement of working children includes somewhere around 10,000 NATs, or Niños y Adolescentes Trabajadores. The NATs are between the ages of 8 and 17, with the vast majority being between 11 and 15. And they're a fairly gender balanced group. They come from poor and working class families. They're involved in a wide variety of work practices, working on family farms and family market stalls and businesses, street vending, either alone or with others, working as porters, carrying things in the markets, providing help around the house. They're mostly working in the informal economy, and all of them are also in school, as is the case for most working children in Peru. Now, the movement is organized into base groups, each with somewhere between 5 and 25 NATs. Each base group also has at least one adult supporter or colaborador who works with them. The bases are then organized into regions. Regions are organized together at the national level, and there are also frequent opportunities for international coordination and collaboration across Latin America. And then in contrast to abolitionist approaches that call for an end to child labor, the movement emphasizes working children's leadership on this issue and the need to end the exploitation of children and work that's harmful to children, rather than abolishing or criminalizing all forms of children's work. And I'm happy to talk more about this position, which they refer to as valoración crítica, or a critical appreciation of children's work, during the Q&A. But more than just rethinking children's relationship to work and labor, the movement of working children also has a well-developed counter-hegemonic perspective on childhood itself, captured in the concept of children's protagonismo, an idea that was initially constructed in relationship to the concept of protagonismo popular, which was a term used in the late 60s and 70s in Latin America to describe how poor people, neighborhood groups, women's groups, unions, indigenous groups, etc., were claiming space as protagonists or central actors in the national political scene. It described the activism and political agency of these groups, their collective power, and their sense of collective identity as a political bloc. And so from this lineage, protagonismo refers to a social group, especially a marginalized social group, coming to see its own significance and claiming space in the political field. From power, often with paternalistic tones, and then arguing that this exclusion is unjust. And then finally, a third major element in their is the idea of intergenerational horizontalism, or the ideal of transforming and equalizing the power dynamics of adult-child relationships, reducing hierarchy and creating more egalitarian ways of interacting across age differences. And this is a subject I'll come back to and focus on a bit more. So in the book, I argue that this movement directly challenges 5 widespread assumptions about childhood, what I refer to as, first, the binary difference assumption, or the assumption that children and adults are essentially different kinds of humans. Second, the natural assumption, or the assumption that childhood is a natural and universal category with fixed traits and characteristics. Third, the passivity assumption, or the assumption that children are uncritical sponges who just absorb the perspectives of adults. Fourth, the exclusion assumption, or the assumption that children should be prevented from participation in both work and politics. And fifth, the power assumption, or the assumption that adults' power over children is just, inevitable, or necessary, and that it shouldn't be diminished. And then I make this argument by first articulating the movement's conceptualization of childhood as a space of social, political, and economic subjectivity and engagement. Then I map their multiple interpretations of intergenerational equality. Shifting from discourse to practice, I then look at the interpersonal relationships between adult colaboradores and the Nats, focusing on the tensions between horizontalism on the one hand and teaching and education that are embedded in the role of the colaborador, looking at how different colaboradores manage these dynamics in relation to their own particular aged, gendered, racialized, and class identities. Chapter 5 zooms in on issues of decision-making power and authority in the movement, highlighting the complex role of adolescents. And then finally, I take a wider view to address the impacts of the movement on Peruvian childhoods and on working children's lives outside of the movement context. Today, I'm going to focus just on some of the dynamics around challenging age-based power that really ground Chapter 5, a little bit of Chapter 3, but I'm happy to answer questions about any of this during the conversation. So my analysis is really based on over 12 months of fieldwork conducted between 2012 and 2017, mostly in and around Lima, Peru's capital. And in addition to extensive ethnographic observation of a whole variety of public and private movement activities, which mostly means meetings. If you study social movements, that actually mostly means studying meetings. I draw a lot on in-depth interviews with 9 adults and 13 young participants, as well as the analysis of websites, publications, flyers, pamphlets, training manuals, and all kinds of other relevant movement materials. And then drawing on both feminist and Foucauldian conceptions of power, my approach is not so much to try to assess power as a quantity, to ask who has more or who has less, but instead to look at the distribution and operation of different modalities or forms of power. I'm trying to move beyond simplistic binaries of children as either active or passive, liberated or oppressed, or independent or manipulated, by delineating how multiple forms of power and authority are produced, negotiated, and contested by children and adults. And then finally, I take an intersectional perspective. Age-based power intersects and interacts with, but also operates quite differently from other axes of social difference, gender, race, class, etc. So in analyzing intergenerational relationships in the context of social movements, I try to think with and alongside the work of US feminists of color and transnational feminists who've written extensively about creating political coalitions across lines of difference and inequality. Okay, so that's more than enough background and context. We'll get into some more of the details. So articulated sometimes with the concept of igualdad or equality, and sometimes with the language of horizontalidad or horizontalism, movement participants express really deep commitments to transforming and equalizing the power dynamics of adult-child relationships. At the level of discourse or ideology, they emphasize 3 main points that undergird that political vision. First, they talk about the fundamental equal worth, dignity, and humanity of children and adults. Second, they take the position that everyone is still learning and growing, and that everyone, no matter their age, is capable of learning and growing in new ways. So kids can be equally capable as adults. It all depends on opportunities to learn. I often think about this in terms of the fact that no one is born knowing how to facilitate a meeting, right? But anyone can learn how to do it. So a 12-year-old might have more skills at doing this if they've been facilitating meetings since they were 10 than a 30-year-old who has never facilitated a meeting, depending on their experiences. They also talk about children as having distinctive knowledge, expertise, and insights to offer, and the idea that their ideas should be valued and taken as seriously as those of adults. And then these 3 core beliefs really challenge assumptions about adult superiority, and importantly, question the relevance of chronological age as a criterion for value. They provide the ethical foundations for the movement's aspirational vision of intergenerational horizontalism. But how does horizontalism work? What does it look like? How do you actually do it? Overall, the move toward horizontalism is embodied through relational practices where children and adults work together on a shared social movement agenda while treating each other with deep mutual respect and care. The adult colaboradores in the movement consistently acknowledge and treat children as active subjects who are capable of critical thinking and analysis. The Nats regularly engage in meaningful political dialogue and strategic planning with adults who they know will listen to them, respect them, and take their ideas seriously, even when they disagree. They're attentive to the quality of these relationships, and they try to be reflective and self-critical about the extent to which they are, in fact, disrupting conventional age-based hierarchies. There's a kind of critical age consciousness that permeates the movement. However, this crucial discursive and relational foundation doesn't mean that age-based power is entirely absent or erased from movement dynamics. So how does it manifest then? And here's where I find it helpful to parse out how age dynamics shape different forms or modalities of power within the movement. We'll start by talking a little bit about disciplinary power. In the regional and national assemblies, the Nats vote on who will be their regional and national colaboradores, or their adult supporters for a given term. And in the lead up to that vote, the Nats discuss what traits they think are important in a colaborador, what they like and don't like about individual colaboradores' styles, and then they determine which adults are best suited to support them in their work. I only saw this process once and it was pretty painless that time, but many Nats told me stories about times when it was very tense and very uncomfortable for the colaboradores as kids from their base groups describe the strengths and weaknesses of each adult in detail. And in this practice, we can see one way that the movement tries to increase children's formal authority. It makes individual adults' participation in some of the key spaces, the spaces of political decision-making in particular, entirely contingent upon the kids' approval and acclamation. It should be obvious that this kind of power is not common in intergenerational spaces. Young people usually don't get to hire the staff for most community-based organizations that cater to them. Children don't usually get to select the mentors or tutors that are in their after-school programs. And this is a change that the Nats really appreciate. As Yolanda, one girl, said, if we don't like what the adults are doing, we get to replace them. So another kind of formal authority that disrupts some of the traditional norms for adult-child interactions also centers around rulemaking. The colaboradores may remind kids to pay attention. They occasionally will separate kids who are being disruptive or having side conversations during an assembly. They sometimes intervene to stop various small fights, but they never mete out any kind of punishments or consequences for children's actions. There's no detentions, no timeouts, no extra tasks given for any kind of misbehavior from adults. Instead, the kids themselves are in charge of any system of discipline that they want to have or create. And in one base group, for example, there have been problems with kids not attending the weekly assemblies at the frequency that some of the other kids think they should. And so in 2 different years, at 2 different meetings, I saw groups of kids decide that in order to better motivate their peers to attend, they would start imposing fines on those who didn't attend. And then those students also could, or those young people wouldn't be able to participate in any of the activities in the following week. Now, it was never clear to me if the young people actually ever implemented this fining activity, but it was a way to at least sort of symbolically say, like, we think this matters, we want you to show up. And importantly, it sets the kids up themselves as the arbiters of acceptable and unacceptable behavior in the context of the movement and displaces some of that kind of authority away from adults. And this then allows adults and kids in the movement to have a relationship not at all tied to dynamics of rule enforcement, while also encouraging the kids to feel responsible for and to each other. So these 2 practices really formalize children's collective authority over adults and over each other, especially in terms of the power to determine inclusion and exclusion from certain spaces, and the power to institute and enforce norms of behavior. So in this modality, we can see how the movement of working children flips a more common intergenerational power dynamic. But social movements aren't just locations for interpersonal relationships, they're also essentially deliberative spaces, right? Activists have to discuss their visions and their goals, make decisions about their strategies and tactics. So in these particular contexts, questions about the power of speech are really essential. I've published a lot more on this particular modality of age-based power dynamics than others, so I'm just going to be really brief here. And just note that while children's speech is really actively encouraged in a multitude of ways, and kids in the movement have abundant opportunities to express themselves, they also still think that the adults talk too much in many key conversations as the result of a very persistent and often hard to disrupt intergenerational habitus of adult speaking and children listening. But how different people are heard within the movement is also shaped by their age, right? It's not just about who speaks and how often, but how those voices are responded to. Although adolescents are usually more confident in their self-expression, they speak more often, Younger kids' voices have substantial symbolic power within the movement. Given the discourses about childhood and about the value of children's insights, when young children speak up, everyone listens carefully, and it can be a kind of performative act of the older adolescents sometimes to listen especially closely to the very youngest children. Because a key part of the movement's ideology is this commitment to being child-led, not just adolescent or youth-led. And so therefore, the statements of the very youngest kids are really given pretty substantial attention. But while kids' voices have a great deal of power, many kids also will note that they listen more carefully to the opinions of adult colaboradores because, quote, they know more. As Andres, a 12-year-old boy, said, quote, their opinion is important to us. They support us. They have more experience. They're older already. And this view is supported by the frequent practice of the adults giving the nuts what they call an orientation in advance of many discussions. And sometimes this orientation just presents information. For example, the organizations may have been asked if they want to send representatives to an upcoming event. The colaborador has information about that event, or the colaboradores may describe the various players in an upcoming legislative debate. So the practice of colaboradores providing this kind of information is understandable, given that they often have longer histories in the movement that give them particular insights, and they sometimes have institutional positions that make them recipients of really pertinent information. But sometimes this orientation positions adults not just as useful sources of information, but also as primary sources of knowledge. And this sometimes leads kids, especially those who are newer to the movement, to say things like, colaboradores orient us, respect our opinions, tell us what is good, and tell us what is bad. Or, quote, they let us know what we're talking about, why we're talking about it, and what are the important things to focus on. They tell us what we should do. Now, movement materials are very careful not to position adults in this way. They try not to signify adults as experts, but despite adults' desire not to be treated as expert voices, some kids, particularly those who are newer to the movement, continue to view adults as more knowledgeable, giving their words additional weight in any deliberation. So in thinking about the question of influence, a dynamic unique to age-based power begins to emerge, the complex but intractable relationship between age and experience. On the one hand, children's ideas are treated as important and are influential in the movement because of their present day experiences. They know what it is to be a child, a working child in particular, right now. On the other hand, adults' contributions are valued because of their many years of experience with the movement and with political action. And both of these kinds of experience are seen as producing knowledge and as generating particular types of expertise. But expertise generated over time, which is the expertise held by adults, is more generally valued in the larger social context. And so unsurprisingly, this dominant perspective also sometimes filters into movement interactions, with kids sometimes valuing adult ideas over those of their peers. Now, the relationship between age, experience, and expertise becomes even more tangled when we start to look at another modality of power, which is formal leadership responsibilities within the movement. The Nats elect delegates to lead their base groups and to work in coordinating bodies at the regional, national, and international levels. And these delegates play a key role in planning movement activities, from developing annual strategic plans to setting the agenda for most meetings or assemblies. And in general, to be elected as a delegate at any level, you have to have 2 years of participation at the level you're representing. So 2 years in your base group before becoming a regional delegate, 2 years as a regional delegate before becoming a national one, and so on. Now, movement discourse generally rejects the idea that chronological age should be used as a marker of your ability to do something. And that rejection is really a key to their critique of minimum age standards for children's work. And so instead of focusing on age, participants emphasize experience. But in one regional assembly, I had a chance to see the ways that their discussions of age, experience, and capabilities when they were explaining their votes about who was ready to be elected as a regional delegate. And notably, chronological age continued to matter in these discussions in ways that actually undercut the discourse that age doesn't define ability. So the election of regional delegates was preceded by a session during which the entire assembly of approximately 50 kids evaluated each current delegate. Each group's base and regional delegates were asked to come forward one by one to stand in front of the group and receive feedback. Many delegates of every age were complimented for being friendly, collaborative, responsible, participatory. The younger delegates were praised for being enthusiastic, creative, energetic, but they were sometimes told that they were, quote, not participating much, or that they were shy, or that, quote, this shyness is common when people are new, and I hope that when she gets more comfortable, she'll participate more. So these comments, hoping for the greater participation in a young delegate's future, set up the younger delegates as still being early in their process, suggesting they don't yet have the experience that leads to a more participatory and vocal subjectivity. But in contrast to this type of commentary on younger kids, the adolescents who were described as quiet were not generally framed as shy or as still learning how to participate, but were instead told by their peers that they needed to, quote, take on more responsibility, step up more to meet what's expected of them. And the critiques offered to delegates of different ages suggest that kids themselves treat age as a relevant factor in analyzing each other's leadership. They may frame younger delegates' actions as resulting from a lack of experience, but they don't make this case with older kids, even if those older kids may in fact also be new to the movement, as was sometimes the case. Older kids are expected to be more responsible, more focused, more participatory by their peers of various ages, no matter how much inexperience they have. In contrast, younger kids' quiet or their distractedness is usually explained by their inexperience rather than by their age, allowing movement participants to continue to argue that kids of all ages can be participatory leaders. They just need more experience. So age then matters in what the kids say about each other, but it's also simultaneously denied as being significant for identifying leaders. And that actually matters in who gets elected to these delegates, right? So two young people who may behave in the same way, and I saw this happen, might be, one is identified as needing more experience, the other is told, oh, he's going to be able to do this, he just needs to step up more, so we'll select him as a delegate. So then another important dynamic of this age-based power emerges when we look at what happens when the Nats start to age out of the category of child and then must start to cede their formal leadership authority. So movement regulations are really clear that you can't be a delegate after your 18th birthday. And so depending upon your birthday and its relationship to the 2-year election cycle, some Nats actually age out of leadership positions at 16. And then some of those former delegates, right, who are still younger than 18, participate pretty actively, and some start to kind of pull back at that point. But in any case, at 18, an individual is no longer a Nat, and they must either transition to becoming a colaborador if they wish to continue to be involved in the movement, or entirely step back. And so there's a sharp break in their power and authority as they try to step back from this kind of outspoken leadership, begin to listen more, and take on this new role. And on the one hand, this profound shift is somewhat arbitrary, right? People are not that different before and after their 18th birthday. But on the other hand, this clearly marks a dividing line between kid and adult. And that requires older teens to start to actively confront their increased power, accumulated steadily over their years of involvement in the movement, and then figure out how to give up that power and authority in order to keep the movement kid-led and to pass responsibility along to the next generation of Nats. And so the challenge of learning to constrain one's participation can be substantial for some of them, but it's easier for the ones who already in their later years in the movement began to focus on encouraging the participation of younger Nats. And notably, the practice of encouraging the voices of younger Nats was by far more common amongst teenage girls than teenage boys. The teenage girls were generally more reflective about the amount of power and influence that they had gained over the course of their participation in the movement, and then they worked to reduce that authority. For them, age-based power seemed to be understood more as a continuum rather than on simply a Nat colaborador, child-adult binary, and they saw themselves as having more social power than younger kids, and so therefore as having responsibility to minimize the effects of that power in the context of the movement. Now, their male peers, on the other hand, didn't do as much work bringing forward younger children's participation, instead tending to focus on their own individual leadership skills and capacities, and also seemed more likely to see themselves as not having age-based power in the larger society, and therefore still being in the same position as younger children. But this is one of the really distinctive elements of intergenerational or cross-age political alliances, right? Our relationships, people's relationships to the categories of child, youth, and adult change over time. And these transitions, when they're clearly demarcated in some way, provide an opportunity for individuals to reflect on the workings of age-based power. So for delegates in the movement of working children, having the experience of holding substantial political authority planning authority as a child, and then learning to cede some of this particular power, on the one hand can be a challenge, but it also gives them a chance to reflect actively on their own adulthood and to carefully consider how they will interact with children as they age out of the category itself. So, what does all of this tell us about the possibilities and challenges for building intergenerational social movements that include children as real partners in struggle? First, and most basically, the movement of working children makes abundantly clear that young people, including children as young as age 8, can make important contributions to social movements. When given an opportunity, they will gladly and effectively take on a variety of roles and responsibilities within activist spaces. Second, the movement of working children shows us that relationships between children and adults can be more equal or more horizontal than our dominant social norms. The Nuts who participate in the movement describe it as a unique and counter-hegemonic space where they experience deep respect and meaningful power. As Graciela, a 16-year-old, put it, in society, there isn't equality between adults and kids because the adult is seen as being above, seen as knowing more, and the kid is seen as below, as not being able to make his or her own decisions. The kid should just think and do what the adult says. But when you're in the movement, all this changes. It goes away. Now, while Graciela is correct to identify the movement as a place where intergenerational power dynamics change and where adults are not always above kids, age-based inequalities also don't entirely go away. Instead, analyzing the multiple modalities of power within the movement can help us see how difficult it can be to completely dismantle our hierarchical intergenerational habitus. Patterned and power-charged interactions rooted in a culture of adult dominance and children's marginalization are not simply vanished from the space, but continue to shape it in subtle ways. And this is not unique to the movement of working children. We should not see this as a failure. It is always a challenge in any attempt at prefigurative horizontalist political relationships across lines of social difference. But so where does this then leave me when well-meaning adults ask how they can best support young activists? On the one hand, there's some very specific things that young people say that they want from adult allies. Resources, both financial and not, help accessing decision makers or other authority figures, institutional memory, particularly previous commitments from institutions that haven't been held, logistical labor, amplification of their messages. And these are the easy answers for how to support child and youth-led movements. But some young activists also say they want much more from adults, right? They want us to join them in their struggles, to work alongside them as partners in pursuit of a shared political vision. And this, I think, is where we still need much more learning and thinking. The theories and practices of intersectionality, anti-oppression organizing, and coalition building, most extensively developed by Black feminists, give us some really useful conceptual and practical tools for this work, and we can look to and learn from other movements and histories for guidance. But age-based power also operates with its own distinct logic, giving us new and particular challenges to navigate. I talked about some of these dynamics already, but I want to open up now a bit beyond what can be seen in the ethnographic material. So one thing I've been tracking quite a bit lately is the propensity to see any adult involvement in young people's movements as evidence of manipulation. So in response, children might be talked about as pawns or as being used by adults. So in response, movements like the Peruvian movement of working children end up bending over backwards to make the case that instead children are autonomous, they're in charge, they're doing it all on their own. And this profoundly impoverishes their ability to actually talk about how age-based power works. When adult collaborators and allies are constantly trying to avoid the accusation of using youth, they're forced to deny their contributions and claim that it's all just the youth, it's just the kids, they're just doing it, right? Rather than engaging in a much more careful and critical discussion of their various roles and responsibilities in social movement contexts. And the zero-sum narrative is one that applies uniquely, I think, to intergenerational activism. So it's just an example. It would be unimaginable to claim that the presence of some white activists in the Black Lives Matter movement means that Black folks are being used to further the agenda of those white individuals. So intergenerational activism is also unlike many other coalitional approaches in that the roles taken on by adults in these movements are also much more extensive than that normally associated with the idea of the ally or the accomplice. So my co-author Hava Gordon and I have written some about how allyship is in fact not necessarily a very good description for what actually happens in many intergenerational social movement spaces. Adults take on key roles as funders, logistical coordinators, repositories of historical memory and continuity, trainers and educators, and even social workers. Children are not autonomous. They're still quite dependent on adults for many political, legal, and economic reasons, and this matters quite a bit for our partnerships. So while there's currently a lot of enthusiasm about the idea of intergenerational social movements, and I am absolutely thrilled to see children being acknowledged as political actors and agents, I also see a need for more analysis about how age-based power operates within and beyond social movements. And here I think is an area where childhood studies as an academic field can make a very powerful contribution, helping activists and advocates of all ages to develop their collective understanding of the operating logics and structures of age-based power, and therefore how to disrupt these dynamics in our everyday interactions, as well as in our institutions. Thanks. I look forward to hearing your comments, questions, to talking more about all of this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for such a fascinating presentation, Jessica. We'll move over to Stuart now to make a response. In the meantime, do think about your questions and comments. You're welcome to put them in the chat and we'll pick them up after, or to voice them, we'll do a hands when Stuart is finished. So over to you, Stuart.
All right, thanks, Rachel, and thanks, Jessica. It was great to finally get to hear you talk about your work. I've been using your work in my teaching and my own writing for years, mostly on the stuff you've done earlier on youth activism and youth politics, but also this more recent work on childhood. In fact, as it turns out, this week in the module that Rachel mentioned at the beginning, Educating for Social Justice, my students are actually reading the introduction to your book here. So it'd be interesting to have a talk with them in the seminars. What I wanted to do was not talk about the specific case study here, which is really, really interesting, but just some of the kind of broader points that that your work and this talk raised for me in thinking about children and youth and participation. And I thought I wanted to highlight 3 points. And the first point actually was the very last point that Jessica made in her talk, that the title of the talk was Adults Talk Too Much, right? And kind of end up sometimes inadvertently reproducing these age-based hierarchies in child-centered spaces. But I think that last point is there's also a sense that adults talk too little about the work that they do in these child and youth-centered spaces. I think for me, that's a really important point that Jessica made at the end about, the kind of that pressure to downplay or ignore the role of adults. And I think what Jessica and others have pointed out is that pressure to kind of erase or deny the presence of adults in these centers, because it's this fear of being accused of manipulating children and so forth, it undermines the ability to build powerful movements, because you're forced to erase all those kind of movement building, organizing. But from my interest in education, it also undermines the possibility of doing education, right? Political education, because it makes that invisible. It almost makes political education as something that's taboo, right? Because then you're manipulating these children who are supposed to be non-political and so forth. And so I think for me, that's a really important thing, not just to think about how we do adult participation in these kinds of spaces, but how we talk about and conceptualize adult participation in these spaces. And I think that's kind of the analysis that Jessica was talking about. And that for me is critical to opening up space for thinking about how do we do important political education so we can learn how to facilitate meetings or strikes or those kind of things, whatever age we are. So that was the first point that I wanted that kind of really stands out for me in this work. The second point was actually when I was rereading Jessica's work and then listening to Jessica talk just now, particularly about the kind of tensions and dilemmas between the adult collaboradores, I think you call them, and the children, that there were strong parallels between dilemmas that you find in community organizing between organizers and leaders. So in community organizing, often talk about organizers as paid organizers who are working with a community, often a marginalized community, to help mobilize them and support their needs. And then leaders are members of the community who are, in charge of the organization. And in the literature on community organizing, you have almost identical issues in terms of relationships between the organizers and the leaders around this. And this is not organized around age at all, right? It may be organized sometimes around class and gender and race, but and I guess the kind of what it raises for me is when we're thinking about participation and voice and so forth, whether it's helpful to think about the particular fields of practice that we're talking about. In other words, what are we doing? Organizing, movement building? Are we doing educating? Are we doing production of some kind, service provision? And that possibly some of these dynamics are particularly to the field of organizing and social movement building, right? And just to give an example of that, if we're thinking about community organizing and social movement building, then in terms of building voice, yes, on the one hand, there's concern with distributing voice and participation throughout the members of a community, whether they're a community of neighbors or workers or children, and having that kind of democratic inclusion. But in terms of making social change, a lot of organizers talk about the importance of identifying organic leaders, right? So individuals within a community who stand out as having particularly dense social relationships with other members of the community, so that when they speak or act, others are more willing to follow them, whether we're talking about a group of workers or a group of children and so forth, which is a bit different to the kind of more flat, kind of distributed idea of participation and voice and so forth that we sometimes get if we're just talking about wanting children to participate, right? So in the field of organizing, social movement building, making social change, there's different kinds of issues around leadership that might be important. That might be different to thinking about this in educating or other kinds of spaces. Yeah. And then the last point that I think is for me really important, and for me this has always been why Jessica's work has been so useful, is really insisting that we don't take the social category of childhood or youth for granted as being self-evident, but really kind of ask what's at stake in terms of bringing in these categories of childhood or youth, both for us as observers, but also for the participants themselves, right? And so if you have this movement of Peruvian working children, then we could foreground this as being a movement about children, right? Or we could think about this as a movement of workers or members of the working class, or we could think about this as individuals who are Peruvian and possibly particular kinds of Peruvian, so indigenous Peruvian and so forth, and that which categories get foregrounded may have real consequences for how both these organizations are perceived by outsiders, but how they work themselves. And Jessica has a wonderful article on this, and talking about how the movement itself, this movement of Peruvian working children, has over its history kind of shifted, I think, in terms of which of these categories tend to be foregrounded in relation to shift to broader political environment, but also pointing out the consequences for that. And for me, I kind of wonder about, and I think this is a more general issue with child and youth participation, is that as we kind of foreground this category of children in relationship to the category of being workers or working class or being Peruvian or indigenous, that even as we're supposing to do this in the interest of empowerment and participation, by bringing in this category, we kind of delimit it, right? We see this very often whenever people talk about trying to foster youth participation. As soon as you label it as youth participation, it often narrows it and limits it and undermines it in some sense. And I think Jessica has written about the kind of, if you think about power relationships, not just in terms of things that Jessica was talking about in this talk, the internal dynamics of the organization and how age plays out, but also how this movement is related to other movements in Peru. I think Jessica, I'm correct to say that you've pointed out how as childhood has become foregrounded, one of the effects of this movement has become more distant from other kind of adult-led labor movements or social movements and so forth, and kind of have an undermining of the power of this movement. So again, the kind of issue of how we think about the role these categories are playing. So again, for me, those are all really, really valuable points that I take from the talk and from the work. And I'll end there and then turn it over to everybody else.
Wonderful. Thanks, Stuart. Some really productive comments. Jessica, do you want to come back on any of those points while people are thinking about questions?
They're great. Yeah. Thank you so much, Stuart. It is a real gift to hear how people engage with your work and what they find useful in it. So I appreciate it really, really deeply. It's interesting. I think this point about what kind of space we're talking about. I've been thinking about this a lot lately as the new work that I've just started, and I'm doing some field work on here is starting to look at the relationship between child-led movements and child-centered NGOs, the big I NGOs in particular, and the ways that they have thought about children's participation, and then the ways that they've supported, not supported, worked with and around movements. And I think that for me, part of what is so fundamentally significant and important in my own work is that I am interested in movements, right? That I'm not interested just in sort of participatory spaces or consultative councils or other kinds of forms of young people's participation. That movements and building movements is absolutely kind of at the forefront. But I'm not sure, and I think that you're right to sort of that some of these issues come up in a particular model of community organizing that thinks about leadership in a particular way. I actually see the movement of working children's approach to leadership to be more kind of in line with sort of anarchist, prefigurative, horizontalist leadership models in some ways, right? Like on the one hand, they have clear hierarchies of like delegates and so on and so forth, right? And so they are always looking for a kind of organic leadership from within, and some of the dynamics around community organizing and who's a good leader and who's not a good leader, some of those things I do think are similar. But I also think that because of their emphasis on prefigurative horizontalist politics, there's also a kind of tension around any kind of leadership that comes up, right? And so this is where I actually think the social movement literature on different models of leadership and different kinds of organizing structures is actually quite helpful, because it is a movement. And so it's dealing with some similar dynamics around how we imagine what leadership looks like, what is participatory democracy, what does it mean to be horizontal, how do we prefigure a new kind of social world? And so I think, yeah, that's absolutely right to be thinking about it specifically as a kind of movement space, not a participatory, broadly kind of children's club, right?
Great, thank you. So just an invitation, yep, perfect. People are putting up their hands, and I can see some questions in the chat. Rashi, I see you've put a question in the chat. Would you like to turn your audio and or video on and say the questions, or shall I read them?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I'll just unmute my audio. So thank you so much for your wonderful work, sharing your wonderful work, Jessica. And I am basically a trained social worker from India and studying currently at King's College London, doing my master's in international child rights and development. And I am really delighted to hear about your work. So I had some few basic questions based on what you had shared. Firstly, and in terms of the case study only of Peruvian working children that you had shared, first was, what are the risks associated with these children being part of the movement? That was that was my first query. And the second one is that what is the future? What basically is the objective that this movement is, the vision that this movement is holding towards the rights of working children? And thirdly, what does the future hold for them after they turn 18? Apart from being collaborators in future, what else does the future hold for them when they're associated with the movements during their childhood and beyond after that, after they turn adults? Thank you so much once again. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Let me start with the last one. So there's no kind of systematic empirical study of how participation in the movement, despite the fact this movement's been around for 40 years, has been pretty extensively studied. There's not any empirical studies that actually track the sort of systematic effects of participation on adulthood of these young people afterward. But despite that, anecdotally, there is a ton of evidence that the young people who participate continue to be engaged in all kinds of forms of political action, especially the folks that sort of achieve the like regional and national delegate levels. So one sort of key example of a young person whose first political organizing was in the movement is Tanya Pariona, who went on to be a congressperson in Peru after her experience in this movement, right? So she's a young indigenous girl who organized within the movement of working children, then participated in young women's indigenous community organizing and movement spaces, and then was elected to Congress from Ayacucho. There's also lots of evidence of young people experiencing some pretty significant upward economic mobility in terms of moving on to more sort of professional careers, social workers, teachers, et cetera, that the kind of supports of the movement got them access to different kinds of educational opportunities and resources, in some traveling abroad for study, and having been exposed to sort of international conferences in the movement, and then sort of having this idea that they could go internationally for university. And from very, very, very poor backgrounds. So some pretty significant examples of upward economic mobility. And then also, because the movement is part of this kind of trajectory and history of Catholic Action Associations, there's the organization or the movement that kind of was the roots of this movement, the Juventud Obrera Cristiana, is also a space in which young people then move on to organize around the youth worker category, and participate in the movement as in that movement as young people. So many of them move on to the HOC for a while and organize in the HOC, and then once they age out of the HOC, come back as colaboradores. They kind of find that they need a break from the childhood space, that it's too hard to transition straight from being one of the Nats right into the role of colaborador. So they go and organize in the HOC for a while, and then they come back later to work as colaboradores and volunteer as colaboradores in the movement. So they're definitely involved in a whole variety of things afterward, and just generally kind of community leaders in various ways. The political vision, I think, is really around these sort of three goals, right? Of like both imagining childhood as a space of full economic, political, and social participation and inclusion, that children should be fully included in all aspects of community life as equals. And then second, this idea of intergenerational horizontalism, that children and adults should interact in a more egalitarian manner, that we need to change our relationships to children and really fundamentally shift the kind of modes of everyday interaction between adults and children. And those are kind of at the level of childhood writ large. And then in terms of working children and working children rights, there's this idea of the critical appreciation of children's work. And so there is a clear kind of policy agenda that pushes back against the abolition or getting rid of all forms of children's work, which is what the ILO's minimum age standards generally do, right? They would say that any child below a given age who is working in any kind of conditions at all is participating in child labor, and this should be disallowed. And the movement of working children says that's not the case. We like our work, we learn from our work, it's how we are valued, it's how we're part of communities, it's how we experience family and belonging, and there's all kinds of things that we get out of work. It's educational, it's pleasurable, it's all of these benefits to us. The problem is exploitation and economic exploitation and harm, right? And so they want to be really specific about preventing certain forms of work or particular working conditions. And they also try to emphasize that, you know, we should be against the labor exploitation of people no matter their age, right? That this should not be particular to children, but that really all labor should be dignified labor. So they talk about supporting trabajo digno, right, or dignified work, and being opposed to exploitation. So that's the kind of political vision around children's work in particular. Other issues come through at various times, but that's the kind of long and the short of it. I think that was all of them, yeah.
Great, thanks, Jessica. Thalia, did you want to, yeah, there you are.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much, Jessica. This was fascinating. I especially like this, what you said about these notions of experience and age and how they sometimes are in tension with each other, and this place and responsibilities of adults in child-led movements. And relating to that, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you negotiated these modalities of power as an adult researcher, both during the empirical work, but maybe also now with publication? Because I know a lot of the time there's this idea that, oh, we must do publications together with young people, but that doesn't always interest young activists.
Yeah.
They have other things that they'd rather do, and that's understandable. So I was
Totally.
wondering,
Yeah, no, absolutely. For me, I think I'm really clear this is not a participatory project. I think I love participatory action research. This is not participatory action research. I make no claims that what I'm doing here is participatory action research, right? The young people didn't design the project with me. They were not involved in any of the kind of thinking about sort of the overall research questions. This was a project I wanted to do because I think that there are incredible lessons to learn from this movement. And from the kids in the movement and the adults in the movement. And I wanted to bring those lessons into a variety of conversations with other movement spaces in particular. And so when I did the empirical work, for me, that meant being really clear and upfront about what I was up to and why I was doing it. And so for me, the practice of just being honest about what I want, why I'm interested, what I was there to do was really important. I also think, the age-based power of the researcher, I think, it's always tricky, right? We ask questions, and most people who ask questions of kids are looking for particular answers, right? The sort of norms of question asking of children for many adults, right, is that either we already know the answer and we're just testing them, right? Like we know what that answer is, or there's something that we sort of are expecting, or right. And so I think there's a lot of work that goes into being really upfront about like, I'm not looking for anything particular. There's no right or wrong answers, and really, really working that point in as many ways as I possibly can. The other thing that's interesting for me in doing this work with kids in particular, in Latin America in particular, is like I would say imperfect Spanish. It's good. It's good ethnographer Spanish. It's functional, but there are also things that I don't know and mess up, and that ability for kids to sometimes then like teach me, I think has helped kind of diminish some of that, not in any kind of like meaning that my age-based power goes away kind of way, right? But like, and I don't try to subscribe to the sort of like least adult model necessarily, right? But I think that there's a way in which being inexpert is helpful. And I also experienced kids, because I was a foreigner, right, navigating through Lima, right? I start the book with a story about a girl who I was supposed to be walking her home after an event. The other collaborators were like, she lives in a kind of dangerous neighborhood. Will you please walk her home? I walk her home. I drop her off at her home. And she's like, no, I'm going to walk you now to the bus stop because it's not safe for you to be here in my neighborhood, white girl from California, right? And so she claimed her expertise like very clearly in that moment and was like, I know more about Lima than you do. And so there were all kinds of ways I think that young people saw themselves as expert on these issues in a way that they were clear that I was not. And I also think when we were working with activists, they also have a kind of like activist kids, activist girls, the high school girls I worked with, there's like a way in which they have a certain kind of strength of belief in their own contributions, and that can sort of diminish some of that distance. Again, doesn't get rid of it, but diminishes it. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. Tafik, you've got your hand up.
Hello, thank you. It was an excellent talk from both speakers. Thank you very much. I was just wondering a little bit around like written communication in terms of a lot of time what comes across either in body language, if you're sitting across from someone and you see their feet are kind of dangling off the chair, not touching the floor, or they have like a very sort of, young sort of child's voice. There's obviously things associated with that. And it sounds like the movement was trying hard to kind of actively not ignore that, but work against those biases. But I think a lot of that goes away in written communication. So if you receive a letter from someone or you read a letter in the paper, it might not be until you get to the end and it says, oh, this was written by James, age 7, that you actually even realize it was by a child. I don't know if you'd seen any of that in your work, or if you think that's kind of scope for like maybe, future progress in any of these movements.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So one of the things that I think happens in particular in Latin American child and youth movements is that because of the kind of political cultures that and the political education practices that these young people are immersed in, is that both their kind of formal speech making when they attend political events and their written sort of documents, proclamations, declarations have a very kind of clear sort of ideological and well-developed political position, right? So I can think of examples, like I was recently reading a declaration from children who were making a statement on violence to the UN Special Rapporteur against violence against children, who made this like long, extensive commentary around capitalism as a source of structural violence. And in some ways, that response, I think what happens in different contexts when they write and speak in formal ways in these very kind of clearly adult terms, is that they get, by those who are not familiar with those political contexts in particular, they get dismissed as too adult, right? That the fact that then they're like, oh, that 7-year-old wrote that can't actually have been really authentically the voice of children. And then the manipulation narrative gets deployed, right? So because they're immersed in a kind of political context of political education where they have these particular ways of speaking, the more that they sound adult in certain ways, the less that they get listened to. So there's a kind of catch-22 that I think happens for young activists, where when they're especially knowledgeable about something, when they cite data and statistics, when they provide a very thorough policy analysis, that's when the manipulation line gets brought in. And so there's that people want to hear their stories, they want to hear their experiences, they want to hear their feelings, but as soon as they start sort of speaking in the language of what is read as adult, then it actually becomes easier for them to be dismissed in some ways, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. So just an invitation again, if anybody's been holding back and you've got a question you'd like to ask, please do raise your hand or pop it in the chat. I'm going to do that very awkward, horrible thing of just sitting for a moment to give people time to think about their questions. Oh, great. Andy, you've relieved us of that uncomfortable moment. Go ahead.
I just thought I'd break the silence. Thank you, Jessica. That was absolutely amazing. I love your work. I think it's great. Just a bit more information about them, like, you know, this relationship that's built up between, is it the Nazi call them Dores, like this relationship that's been built up through time from the 1970s. It's just a bit of context kind of behind that, because what kind of strikes me, you know, and it kind of resonates with the last point that was being made around kind of assumptions about how children talk and assumptions about how children write. You know, it is like thinking of myself in the British context, you know, and I've done a lot of work around, you know, young people and youth participatory structures, etc. And it's around adult expectations of children, you know, and what they think, you know, children are bringing to the table. And I'm just wondering, like, is it around economic interdependency? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, how was this kind of like very collaborative relationship formed? Was it around kind of economic and social interdependency? Just a bit more of a background about how this kind of relationship developed, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the movement in the 1970s really was kind of being founded at this moment when basically, like in this moment of protagonismo popular, when everybody had organizations, right? There were women's organizations, there were youth organizations, there were all, right, in the kind of poor neighborhoods, shanty towns in the outskirts of Lima, everybody was sort of constituting themselves as protagonists, right? And the young people who are part of the Juventud Obrera Cristiana in particular, right? This youth workers organization who had a kind of Catholic, working class, liberation theology, history, and identity. In the context of a pretty significant move to fire any of those kinds of organizers out of factory jobs and a kind of deindustrialization that was happening, they started to think about, well, like what happens to young people of the working class if there are not spaces for young people of the working class to develop class identities together anymore. And they started thinking about, what about kids? What about the kids in our communities? It seems to us that we were active when we were kids, that we could have been considered protagonists in these various ways. Everybody else has an organization. We have an organization. Nobody has there's no kids organization. And their kind of fundamental commitment in that moment was that kids organization be autonomous, that it be fully kid-led to whatever extent possible. And they, as young people, really started to build up that initial impetus toward the idea of an autonomous children's organization, and started working in this kind of sense of like, we're all part of the same community. Everybody has organizations. The kids should have one too, because that's important for us as a class, that children have their own kind of classed organization. And then from there, it has developed, pulling on a variety of theoretical threads. I would say liberation theology continues to be, I think, a really important route in how they understand childhood, how they understand dignity, how they understand what it is to be human. That's really significant. Children's rights frameworks come in the 90s for sure. And then I would say in the kind of turn toward decolonial and indigenous theorizations in the past chunk, 20 years, 15, 20 years, there's also been an increasing engagement with decolonial thinking, with sort of Quijano and sort of major kind of Latin American decolonial thought, and indigenous cosmovisions, and a kind of acknowledgement of the indigenous roots of the movement in a way that was not the case in the kind of initial period when they mostly talked about themselves in terms of a kind of urban working class, even though that urban working class were predominantly indigenous, right? But indigeneity was not a kind of central frame for them until more recently, I would say. But that also shapes then how they think about collaboration and intergenerational interdependence for sure in this moment, I think, the sort of relationalities model.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Anyone else with a burning question or not so burning question? Rosa, you've just unmuted. Were you?
Yes, please. Hello. Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. This was fascinating. I've been wondering, I'm Latin American, I'm Mexican. Throughout your presentation, I've been wondering whether, you know, either by talking to children or young people, anecdotal evidence, or has there been any follow-up about how their participation in the movement and activism might impact interpersonal relationships with adults or peers outside of the movement? And I'm thinking more specifically, for example, teachers, because I'm not sure about Peru, but in Mexico, we still have this very hierarchical model of education.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is really one of the interesting challenges, I think, for the kids in the movement sometimes, is like they have this sense that this space is the space of this kind of intergenerational collaborative model. And then they have to figure out what elements of that they can take and effectively push in other spaces, and where that's just tactically or strategically not wise, right? And they make strategic decisions about it, for sure. So I definitely saw some kids who were like, yeah, I'm organizing in my school. And so when the administrator, the head teacher did X thing that we thought was a problem, I got my peers to have a rally outside and we made a fuss about it, and something happened, right? And other kids who were very clearly like, oh, no, this model of interaction is just internal to the movement. There's no way that I can bring this into school spaces. And then around the family stuff, it also is like often quite fraught. But I saw several instances and heard from kids, and then observed a bunch of times kids using kind of movement terms, movement phrases, but often in a very kind of gentle and humorous way to kind of push their parents to treat them a little bit differently, and using kind of a little bit of wiggling, using some of the kind of ideas and framings from the movement with their parents. And the movement has increasingly been doing a little bit more work with parents, and they have a couple of schools that they have particular relationships with where they're trying to kind of bring this kind of model both into sort of family conversations and into some particular schools. But the family stuff I think is really tricky because they are also really cautious about not wanting to demonize poor and working class parents who are often seen as bad parents. And so there's a lot of like real caution around how to work with parents, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. Really fascinating. Thank you.
Any questions? You're welcome to just post them in the notes if you don't want to turn on your cameras. While we're waiting, I'm going to ask a question that's been sort of percolating, but is about half formed. I was interested just now, Jessica, when you were talking about the idea of the autonomous working children's movement developing as something coming out of a working class movement.
Yeah. Because
one of the things that I had been thinking about earlier in your talk, and also based on Stuart's comments, was this idea that some of the problematics of this idea of separation or autonomy, and not even just the problematics, but the impossibilities of it.
Yeah.
Right. So I think I'm interested if you could kind of make a connection between that historical trajectory, but also what does this have to say around these questions of organizing in autonomous groupings, or are there lessons to be learned from the Peruvian working children's movement around solidarity or cross-sectoral movements?
Totally. And I think that, I think that if you talk to them now, right, they would say that it's not autonomous in the sense of like entirely run by children without some sort of support and intervention and care from adults, right? I think that the initial kind of framing of it as autonomous, though, was a impulse toward wanting key decisions about strategic direction and political vision to be held by children without, and there was a concern with like adults meddling, right, too much in some of that I think comes out of a really important impulse for adults. Like, I think that this is always the kind of tension, right? On the one hand, there's a part of me that wants to say like, yes, we should like step back, support the children doing their child-led work, and give them the space to really make those key strategic decisions and to be in charge, right? The kids should be in charge of their own movements that are about their issues, that are about the things that they care about. Because I think kids are capable of doing so and deserve the space to do so if they want it. But on the other hand, I think that, right, it's clear that these are intergenerational struggles and that they are intergenerational movements, and the desire for that intergenerationality. And increasingly in the Peruvian movement, they started talking more and more about the idea of co-protagonismo, where the colaboradores were co-protagonists alongside the protagonists of the children. And there's a kind of ongoing tension between, well, is it a children's movement or is it an intergenerational movement with some additional level of children's leadership? Like, and I think this for me is why it's really, really important to actually parse out and talk more specifically about different kinds of power, right? And that's exactly why I think we need to be able to say, well, like, okay, well, it's child-led in the sense that children do X, Y, Z, but it's intergenerational in the sense that adults have X, Y, Z, roles and responsibilities and are contributing in these particular ways, and that we're able to actually talk about those power dynamics in a kind of meaningful and relevant way, rather than just saying, well, like, okay, that one's child-led and that one's intergenerational and this one's autonomous, that one's intergenerational collaboration, because it's always much more somewhere in between, usually, if we at least want there to be some sort of gesture toward children's leadership, right? Which I think for me is important, because I think in the kinds of adultist society that we live in, if we don't have spaces that are sort of child-centered, child-led, autonomously-ish, child-driven, then I think we're simply returning to a kind of adultist model in which children are subsumed into the intergenerational, right? So for me, the centering of children's leadership is important in some spaces, but that means we have to be able to talk about power and responsibility and our interconnectedness and what are the appropriate roles of adults in different kinds of spaces, and why would we want to work as partners? What does that even mean? Who's doing what? What kinds of decisions do adults get to make? What kinds should they really not be making? And I think this is where I agree with Stuart that the problem is the kind of manipulation language and the kind of zero-sum model that makes it hard to even have those conversations. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Jessica. Luciana, I'm assuming you've put this in the chat because you'd like me to read it for you. Oh, yes, okay. So Jessica, thank you for your insightful presentation. I was wondering, what is the relationship between children and youth activism in social movements and their families? Is there an influence of their family in the decision to be part of the social movement or in the quality of their engagement? And how do you see families in these intergenerational relations within social movements?
Yeah.
Thanks, Luciana.
Yeah, thanks. That's interesting. So in some cases, there are some kids who are at this point part of a kind of family lineage in the movement, right? That their parents were also involved in the movement, or their aunt. I saw more of that. Their older cousin, right? So there are some kind of like families where movement participation has been kind of passed through generations, and is sort of part of a kind of community's identity. There's one base group in particular that's located in a housing cooperative. And so in that context, the families there have a more kind of like deeper engagement with the movement over time, and a kind of sense that like it's a union housing cooperative. So they were all members of a street cleaning union, and they have this housing cooperative. And so the kids then there are in a base group of the movement of working children. And so for them, the family is a much more kind of central part of the dynamics of the movement. In some of the base groups, families may want their kids to participate because some of the base groups run more sort of like social support centers where kids go for a meal and homework support and childcare. And so there are definitely some families who see these social service centers as like the main thing that their kids are getting out of the movement, and that they want their kids to be there because of this. And so for them, it's not about the kind of political vision, but just to like, this seems like a great community organization that's going to take care of my kids and give them lunch and help them with their homework and do a few other things with them. And so in that sense, there are sometimes families who want their kids to participate. There are some kids in this particular movement, I don't think I had talked to any kids whose parents didn't want their participation, or who sort of saw problems with their participation, or who were concerned about it in any way. In my previous work with high school girl activists, I definitely did. I had more instances of girls whose families were unaware of the activism their daughters were doing, or if they were aware, were unhappy about it in various ways. But in this particular one, I think partly because of the kind of sense, and this is interesting too, I think the orientation toward the concept of the child is actually quite helpful often for the movement in terms of making it seem less political than it is sometimes, right? That like because childhood is imagined as apolitical and just a space of like social service provision and rights and maybe some participation, right? There's a way in which it's like incorporable into some families' frameworks in ways that, so they don't actually know all of the things that are happening.
Great. Thanks so much, Jessica. Okay, well, let me just, on behalf of the Critical Childhood Studies Research Group at UCL, say thank you so much to Jessica for the really inspiring talk, for Stuart for the thoughtful and provoking comments, and everyone for your questions and comments and the discussion, which has been really fascinating. I've popped a link in the chat, so we will put the video up online once it's ready. And to make it available, I've also put a link in as requested for how to get a hold of Jessica's work. Definitely read it if you found today inspiring and exciting, provocative, stimulating. You will find her work so as well. So thank you, and yeah.